The Galactic Council had ruled the stars for 12,000 years. They had seen empires rise and fall. They had watched species grow from simple creatures into space-faring civilizations. They had created peace through diplomacy, trade, and carefully written treaties. Every species that joined the Council followed the same path. They came with hope. They accepted the terms. They bent their knee. When humanity emerged from their small blue world, the Council expected nothing different. Admiral Park stood alone in his private chamber aboard the unyielding Dawn. The ship was the pride of Earth's fleet, built in the orbital shipyards above Mars. It carried 10,000 crew members and enough firepower to destroy a small moon. But against the Council's armada, it was nothing more than a toy. He held a tablet in his hands. The words on the screen had not changed in the 3 hours since he first read them. He had read them 7 times now, hoping to find something different, some hidden meaning, some path forward that did not lead to destruction. The terms were simple. Earth would surrender 60% of its colonies to Council administration. Humans would be forbidden from developing faster-than-light engines beyond Class 3, forever limiting how far they could travel. Their military would be placed under the supervision of the Empire, the Council's enforcers for the past 8,000 years. In exchange, humanity would receive protection, trade access, and a seat at the Council table. They would be allowed to exist. The door behind him opened. Commander stepped inside, her boots clicking against the metal floor. She was 42 years old, born on the lunar colonies, raised in the asteroid mining stations. She had served under Park for 15 years, and she knew him better than anyone alive. "The ambassador is waiting," she said. "He has been waiting for 3 hours." Park did not look up from the tablet. "Let him wait." "Sir, the Council does not like to be kept waiting." "I know." Moved closer, reading the words over his shoulder. Her face did not change, but her hands tightened into fists at her sides. She had read the terms before. Every officer in the fleet had read them. The message was clear: accept or be destroyed. "They call this an invitation," she said, her voice flat and cold. "It reads like a death sentence." Park finally looked up. His eyes were tired. He had not slept in 2 days. The weight of 8 billion human lives pressed down on his shoulders, and he felt every single one of them. 43 species have received these terms before us, he said. All of them accepted. Every single one. Because they had no choice. No, because they chose to survive. He set the tablet down on his desk. Survival is not the same as living. They were once great warriors. Now they serve as laborers in mines. They built the most beautiful ships in the galaxy. Now they build whatever the Council tells them to build. In the diplomatic chamber below, the Council's ambassador waited with perfect patience. His name was, and he was not truly alive in the way humans understood life. He was a crystalline being, grown in the sacred caves of his, shaped by forces older than human civilization. He had delivered these terms to 43 species. He had watched them read. He had watched them calculate. He had watched them accept. He expected nothing different from humanity. Park walked to his window and looked out at the stars. Somewhere out there, past the endless black, was Earth. His daughter lived in a small apartment in New Seoul. She was 12 years old. She had never seen Earth's sky without the shimmer of orbital stations crossing overhead. She had never known a world that was not reaching for the stars. What kind of world would she inherit if he accepted these terms? "They will supervise our military," he said quietly. "Do you know what that means? It means they will decide when we fight, who we fight, what we are allowed to defend." Nodded, "I know. It means that if someone attacks our colonies, we must ask permission to protect our own people. It means that our ships will carry their officers. Our soldiers will follow their orders." He turned to face her. "It means we will no longer be human. We will be pets. The alternative is war." "Yes. We cannot win a war against the Council. Their fleet is 100 times larger than ours. They alone have more ships than every human vessel ever built. Park smiled, but there was no happiness in it. I know the numbers, Commander. I have studied them every day for the past 5 years. I know how many ships they have. I know how many soldiers. I know the power of their weapons and the strength of their shields. Then you know we will lose. Perhaps. He walked to his desk and picked up the tablet one last time. But I also know something they do not. I know what humans are willing to do for freedom. I know what we have done before when the odds were impossible, when logic said we should surrender. He thought of the history he had learned as a boy, the small armies that faced great empires, the revolutions that should have failed, the moments when human beings chose death over chains and somehow, against all reason, survived. Has waited long enough, Park said. Come with me. They walked together through the corridors of the unyielding dawn. Crew members saluted as they passed. Some of them were young, barely out of training. Others were veterans who had served for decades. All of them knew what was happening. All of them knew what was at stake. The diplomatic chamber was a large room at the center of the ship, designed to impress visitors with humanity's growing power. It had not impressed. To him, it looked like a child's drawing compared to the council's great halls. The crystalline ambassador stood as Park entered. His body caught the light and scattered it into rainbow patterns across the walls. His voice came from everywhere and nowhere, a sound like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. Admiral Park, I trust you have reviewed the council's generous offer. I have. And you understand the benefits of acceptance, protection, trade, a voice in galactic affairs. I understand what you are offering. His crystal form pulsed with soft light. Then we may proceed with the signing ceremony. The council will be pleased to welcome humanity into its embrace. Park stood very still. The room was silent. Watched him, her heart pounding in her chest. Tell the council, the admiral said slowly, each word falling like a stone into deep water, that humanity declines to negotiate. For a long moment, nothing happened. Light flickered once, twice, as if the words did not make sense. In 12,000 years, no species had ever refused. The possibility was not even programmed into his understanding. I do not believe I heard you correctly, Admiral. You heard me, we decline. The words rippled outward at the speed of light. Communication networks carried them from ship to ship, from station to station, from world to world. Within hours, every civilization in the known galaxy had received the message. The Empire paused their endless expansion. The collective, once great warriors, looked up from their labor and remembered what pride felt like. The ancient emerged from their meditation caves for the first time in 3 centuries. Humanity had done what no species had done in 12,000 years. They had said no. And every civilization knew that war was now inevitable. The news reached Earth in the middle of the night. President was sleeping when her aide woke her with 3 words that changed everything. Admiral Park had refused. She sat in her bed for a long moment, staring at the wall. Outside her window, the lights of the capital city glowed against the darkness. 8 billion people slept beneath those lights. Most of them did not yet know that their world had changed forever. Was 53 years old. She had been born during the Mars riots, when the first colonists demanded independence from Earth. She had grown up in a world that was always reaching outward, always pushing into the unknown. She had watched humanity spread across the solar system and then beyond, to distant stars that had once been nothing but points of light in the sky. She had never expected to lead her species into war. By morning, the United Planetary Assembly had gathered in the Great Hall beneath the mountains of what had once been Korea. Representatives from every human colony filled the seats, their faces pale with fear and something else, something that looked almost like hope. Walked to the central platform. The hall fell silent. Every eye watched her, every ear waited for her words. 3 days ago, she began, Admiral Park stood before the Council's ambassador and declined their terms. Some of you believe he was wrong. Some of you believe he has doomed us all. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. I am here to tell you that he was right. Whispers rippled through the hall. Some representatives nodded. Others shook their heads in disbelief. The Council has ruled the galaxy for 12,000 years. In that time, 43 species have accepted their terms. Do you know what happened to them? His voice grew harder. There were once warriors who feared nothing. Now they work in mines, digging for metals they will never own. They built ships that could cross the galaxy in days. Now they build what they are told to build when they are told to build it. She stepped forward, her eyes sweeping across the assembly. The Council does not offer partnership. They offer slavery wrapped in pretty words. They offer chains disguised as protection. Her voice rose. They believe we are children. They have measured our ships and counted our colonies and calculated our resources. By their mathematics, we cannot win. The hall was completely silent now. But they have not measured what cannot be counted. They do not understand what makes us human. They do not know our history. They do not know how many times we have faced impossible odds and refused to surrender. They do not know what we are willing to sacrifice for freedom. On the other side of human space, General watched the president's speech on a small screen in his office. He was 71 years old, the oldest serving officer in the Defense Force. His hair had turned white decades ago. His hands trembled slightly when he held things, but his mind was still sharp and his eyes still saw clearly. He had fought in the border conflicts 30 years ago when pirates from the outer colonies threatened the trade routes. He had buried friends on. He had seen what war cost, and he had hoped to never see it again. That hope was gone now. "Sir," said his aide, Lieutenant Han. She was young, barely 25, but she had the steady calm of someone who understood that panic helped nothing. They have moved their third fleet to the boundary. They are positioning for invasion. Nodded slowly. The boundary was the edge of human space, a line of colonies and stations that marked where humanity ended and the Council's territory began. If they crossed that line, the war would truly begin. How long do we have? 6 weeks, maybe less. 6 weeks. It was not enough time. It would never be enough time. They had been fighting wars for 8,000 years. Humanity had been traveling between stars for less than 2 centuries. The gap in experience was enormous. But experience was not everything. Stood from his desk and walked to the window. Outside, he could see the military base stretching into the distance. Transport ships were already lifting off, carrying soldiers to the front lines. Supply vessels moved in careful formations, loaded with weapons and food and medicine. The mobilization had begun before the president even finished her speech. Across every human world, the response was the same. Factories that had been building cargo ships switched to warship production overnight. Scientists who had spent their lives studying alien biology now worked on weapons research. Young men and women lined up at recruitment centers, knowing they might never return home. Lieutenant Han watched the general stare out the window. She had served under him for 3 years, and she had never seen him look so tired, or so determined. "Sir," she said quietly, "do you think we can win?" Was silent for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft but steady. "When I was a boy, my grandmother told me stories about our ancestors. She told me about times when our country was small and surrounded by enemies, times when every logical calculation said we should surrender." He turned to face. "Do you know what our ancestors did?" "No, sir." "They fought anyway. They lost battles, they lost cities, they lost lives, but they never stopped fighting, and eventually, against all reason, they survived." He walked back to his desk and picked up a tablet showing troop movements. "They have numbers, they have experience, they have technology we cannot match, but they have never fought an enemy who would rather die than surrender. They do not understand what that means." Across human space, The same scenes played out again and again. On Mars, the orbital shipyards ran every hour of the day, building vessels faster than anyone thought possible. On Europa, the fishing villages that had once supplied luxury seafood to Earth now supplied protein paste to military rations. On New Sol, schools closed and children were sent to safety bunkers deep underground. In her apartment in that same city, Park's daughter watched the news with her grandmother. She was 12 years old enough to understand what was happening, old enough to be afraid. "Will father be okay?" she asked. Her grandmother was silent for a moment. She had lived through the Mars riots. She had seen what war looked like, even a small one. This war would not be small. "Your father is a brave man," she finally said. "He made a choice that no one else was willing to make. Whatever happens, you should be proud of him." Back in his office, General finished reviewing the latest reports. The numbers were not good. They would never be good, but numbers were not everything. He picked up his communication device and connected to the command network. His voice would reach every officer in the Defense Force. "This is General. In 6 weeks, perhaps less, that will cross into human space. They expect us to break. They expect us to negotiate. They expect us to beg for mercy." He paused, his old voice growing stronger. "They are wrong. We have 6 weeks to show them what humanity is made of. 6 weeks to prepare. 6 weeks to remember who we are." He ended the transmission and looked out the window one more time. The transport ships continued to lift off, carrying young men and women toward an uncertain future. The galaxy had not seen a war like this in 12,000 years. It had forgotten what it meant to fight someone who would not surrender. It was about to remember. The Battle of O began at 3 in the morning, Galactic Standard Time. Most of the human crew were sleeping when the alarms started screaming. They woke to flashing red lights and the distant thunder of weapons fire. They had arrived 1 week early. Admiral commanded the invasion fleet from his flagship, a massive vessel 3 times larger than anything humanity had ever built. He was a decorated warrior, veteran of 16 campaigns against rebellious species. He had never lost a battle. He did not expect to lose this one. His fleet numbered over 800 ships. Against them stood 47 human vessels and a single space station called Station. The mathematics were simple. This battle would last minutes, perhaps an hour at most. Then the path to human space would be open. Gave the order to advance. His ships moved forward like a great wave, their weapons charging, their shields glowing with power. The humans did not retreat. They held their position and waited. Captain O stood on the bridge of the destroyer Han River. He was 38 years old, born on Earth, raised in the military academies of Mars. His ship carried a crew of 200 and enough weapons to destroy a small moon. Against the Armada, it was barely a threat. But was not thinking about mathematics. He was thinking about his crew, about their families back home, about the colonies behind them that would burn if they failed. "All hands to battle stations," he said calmly. "We hold this line until reinforcements arrive." His first officer, Lieutenant Moon, checked her console. "Sir, reinforcements are 12 hours away. We cannot hold for 12 hours. "Then we hold for as long as we can." The first wave of ships crashed into the human defensive line. Explosions lit up the darkness of space. Ships died in seconds, their hulls torn apart by weapons fire. The human vessels fought back with everything they had, targeting engines, weapons systems, communication arrays. For the first hour, the line held. Pilot flew her fighter through the chaos of battle. She was 26 years old, the youngest pilot in her squadron. Her ship was small and fast, designed for hit-and-run attacks against larger vessels. In the crowded space of the battle, speed was the only thing keeping her alive. "Squadron 7, form up on me," she said into her communicator. "We're going for the carriers." The carriers were protected in the center of their formation, launching wave after wave of attack craft. If the humans could destroy even one carrier, it would slow the enemy's advance significantly. Pushed her ship forward, weaving between weapons, fire, and debris. Behind her, 6 other pilots followed. 3 of them died in the first minute. 2 more died in the second. By the time she reached the carriers, she was alone. But she did not stop. Her ship's weapons were small compared to the carrier's shields. 1 shot would do nothing. 2 shots would do nothing, but had studied the carrier designs. She knew their weak points. She knew where to aim. She flew straight at the first carrier, firing continuously. Her shots hit the same spot again and again, slowly wearing through the shields. Alarms screamed in her cockpit. Her fuel was running out. Her weapons were overheating. She did not stop. The shields collapsed. Her final shot struck the carrier's engine core. The explosion was beautiful, a flower of fire blooming in the darkness of space. The blast wave hit her ship and sent her spinning into the void. When rescue teams found her 14 hours later, she was still alive. Her ship's life support had failed hours ago. She had survived by sealing herself in her flight suit and breathing recycled air. Her first words when they opened her cockpit were simple. "Did we win?" They had not won, but they had not lost either. On station, Engineer Shin worked in the reactor core. She was 45 years old, the station's chief engineer for the past decade. She knew every wire, every pipe, every system in the entire facility. When they began their assault on the station, she was the only one who could keep it running. The reactor had been hit 3 times. By all calculations, it should have failed after the first hit, had kept it running through the second hit, then the third. She worked with burned hands and bleeding fingers, rerouting power and repairing damage faster than the enemy could cause it. "Chief, we need to evacuate," said her assistant, a young man named. "The shields are failing. We have maybe 20 minutes." Looked up from her work. Through the viewport, she could see the ships approaching. Their weapons were charging for the final assault. "How many civilian transports are still docked?" 3. They're loading now, but they need at least 30 minutes to reach safe distance. 30 minutes, they had 20. Turned back to the reactor. Her hands moved across the controls, adjusting settings, pushing systems beyond their safe limits. The reactor hummed with dangerous energy. "I can give them 40 minutes, she said, "but I'll need to stay here to keep it stable." His face went pale. "Chief, if you stay, you'll die." "Maybe, maybe not," she smiled, a strange, calm smile. "Go help with the evacuation, make sure everyone gets out." He wanted to argue. He wanted to drag her away from the reactor and force her onto a transport. But he saw the look in her eyes, and he knew that nothing he said would change her mind. "It's been an honor, Chief." "The honor was mine." Worked alone for the next 3 hours. The station shook with impacts. Fires broke out and were contained. Systems failed and were repaired. She talked to herself as she worked, telling stories about her childhood on Earth, about the ocean she had swum in as a girl, about the stars she had dreamed of reaching. When they finally breached the station, they found her standing in front of the reactor core. She held a welding torch in one hand and a communicator in the other. Through the communicator, she could hear the voices of the transport captains, confirming that they had reached safe distance. The soldiers surrounded her, their weapons raised. Their commander stepped forward, a massive creature in gleaming armor. "You have lost," he said. "Surrender and you will be treated fairly." Laughed. It was a tired laugh, the laugh of someone who had worked beyond exhaustion, but it was also a proud laugh. "You want this station," she said. "Come and take it." She swung the welding torch at the reactor's main coupling. They fired, but they were too late. The reactor exploded, taking the station and every enemy soldier on board with it. The Battle of ended 6 hours later. They held the system, but their losses were enormous. Had expected to lose perhaps 50 ships. He lost 300. He had expected the battle to last hours. It lasted 2 days. 11 days later, Human reinforcements arrived and drove the back. The system changed hands twice more before the front line stabilized. Across the galaxy, other civilizations watched and whispered. The humans had lost the battle, but they had not surrendered. They had not negotiated. They had fought with a ferocity that the galaxy had not seen in 12,000 years. For the first time in living memory, someone was fighting back. And everyone wondered what would happen next. 2 years had passed since the Battle of 442. 2 years of fire and death and impossible survival. 2 years that had changed the galaxy forever. Admiral No stood before the tactical display aboard the Soul's memory, studying the patterns of light that represented fleets and territories and the fates of billions. She was 38 years old, the youngest admiral in human history. She had not asked for this command. It had been given to her when her predecessor died at 442, when his ship was destroyed protecting evacuating civilians. She had promised herself that his death would not be meaningless. 2 years later, she was keeping that promise. The display showed something that would have seemed impossible at the start of the war. Human forces had pushed deep into territory. The great empire that had enforced the Council's will for 8,000 years was crumbling. Their allies had begun to waver. 3 minor species had already defected, choosing humanity's uncertain future over the Council's fatting order. "Admiral," said her communications officer, Lieutenant Minu. His voice was carefully neutral, but she could hear the tension beneath it. "They are requesting a ceasefire." No did not look away from the display. "What are their terms?" "Return to pre-war boundaries, limited trade access, supervised demilitarization." She almost laughed. The sound caught in her throat and died there. "The same terms they offered before the war." "Yes, Admiral." 2 years of fighting, millions of human lives lost, colonies burned, families destroyed, and they were offering the exact same terms they had started with, as if nothing had happened, as if the blood meant nothing. "They still don't understand," she said quietly. Minu waited for her to continue. She did not. Instead, she turned to a different screen, one showing reports from the front lines. Ship movements, supply routes, the thousand small details that decided wars. On the planet below, Dr. Lee was working in a field hospital. She had been a pediatrician before the war, specializing in childhood development. She had spent her days helping children grow, tracking their progress, celebrating their small victories. Now she spent her days trying to keep young people alive long enough to fight again. The hospital was a temporary structure, built from prefabricated units that could be assembled in hours and moved in minutes. It was supposed to hold 200 patients. It currently held 412. Every bed was full. Every corridor had patients lying on makeshift stretchers. The smell of antiseptic and blood was everywhere. Moved from patient to patient, checking vitals, adjusting medication, offering what comfort she could. Her hands were steady even when her heart was not. She had learned to separate her emotions from her work. She had learned to save tears for later when she was alone, when no one needed her strength. A young soldier was brought in on a stretcher. His chest was torn open by plasma fire, the kind of wound that killed most people before they even reached medical care. He was perhaps 20 years old, with a face that still held traces of the boy he had been. His name was Bay. He had enlisted the day after the war began, lying about his age to join early. He had fought in 6 battles. He had watched friends die. He had killed enemies he had never met and would never understand. Looked at his wounds and felt her heart sink. The damage was severe. His chances were not good. "Am I going to die?" asked. His voice was weak but clear. His eyes were open, looking up at her with the calm acceptance of someone who had already faced death many times. Had answered this question 1,000 times. She had lied 1,000 times, telling patients what they needed to hear, giving them hope when there was none. But something in his eyes stopped her. He was not asking for comfort. He was asking for truth. Not today, she said. Not if I have anything to say about it. She worked for 6 hours. Her back ached. Her eyes burned. Her hands cramped from holding surgical tools. But she did not stop. She repaired damaged tissue and sealed bleeding vessels and pulled fragments of shrapnel from places they should never have reached. When she finished, was breathing on his own. His heart was beating steadily. Against all odds, against all medical probability, he was going to live. Stepped back from the operating table and let out a breath she had not realized she was holding. Around her, nurses moved to clean up and transfer the patient to recovery. They looked at her with something like awe. "Doctor," one of them said, "I've never seen anyone do what you just did." Shook her head. "I just did my job, the same as everyone else." But she knew it was more than that. Every life she saved was a victory. Every patient who walked out of her hospital was proof that humanity would not be broken. They could destroy ships and burn colonies. They could kill soldiers by the thousands, but they could not kill what made humans fight. They could not kill hope. Back on the Soul's memory, Admiral No was composing her response to the ceasefire offer. She thought about the soldiers who had died at. She thought about Captain O, who had driven his ship into the enemy flagship. She thought about Engineer Shin, who had died holding a welding torch and a smile. She thought about all the people who had sacrificed everything so that humanity could reach this moment. The thought they were offering peace. They were not. They were offering surrender wrapped in diplomatic language. They were offering the same chains they had offered at the beginning, painted in different colors. No typed her response. It was one word: no. She sent it and turned back to the tactical display. The war was not over. They still had fleets. They still had allies. They could still win if humanity grew tired, if the losses became too great, if hope finally died. But hope had not died at. It had not died in the burning colonies or the crowded hospitals or the endless battles. It had grown stronger with each sacrifice, each victory, each defiant word. The ceasefire offer had contained another message, hidden beneath the official terms. A private note from the high command to the human leadership. It was simple and direct. "You cannot sustain this forever. Eventually you will break. We can wait." No read it once, then deleted it. They were right about one thing. Humanity could not sustain this forever. The losses were enormous. The resources were running low. Every battle cost more than they could afford. But they were wrong about something else. They thought humans would break when the cost became too high. They did not understand that for humans, some things were worth any cost. Freedom was one of those things. In the recovery ward, Bay opened his eyes. The ceiling above him was white and clean, so different from the smoke-filled skis of the battlefield. He was alive. Against all odds, against all expectations, he was still alive. A nurse noticed him waking and hurried over. "Don't try to move," she said. "You've been through major surgery. You need rest." Nodded weakly. His chest hurt, breathing hurt, everything hurt, but he was alive. "The doctor who saved me," he said. "What was her name?" "Dr. Lee." He repeated the name silently, committing it to memory. Someday, when the war was over, he would find her and thank her properly. Someday, when they had won. Because they would win. He was certain of that now. Not because the odds were in their favor. Not because they had more ships or better weapons or stronger allies. They would win because they refused to lose. They would win because giving up was not something humans knew how to do. Outside the hospital, transport ships continued to move. Soldiers headed to the front. Supplies headed to the colonies. The war machine of humanity kept turning, kept fighting, kept refusing to accept the chains the galaxy had prepared for them. The tide was turning. Everyone could feel it. The question was no longer whether humanity would survive. The question was what kind of galaxy would exist when the war was finally over. The war ended not with a treaty, but with silence. For 5 years, the galaxy had burned. Fleets had clashed across 1,000 systems. Worlds had fallen and risen and fallen again. The death count had reached numbers that stopped meaning anything, numbers that were too large for any mind to truly understand. And then slowly, the fighting stopped. The empire, stretched beyond breaking by the endless war, collapsed from within. Their subject species rose up, inspired by humanity's defiance. They remembered that they had once been warriors and took back there in a single bloody night. Those master shipbuilders turned their skills to creating vessels for their own use instead of their masters. The Galactic Council, that ancient institution that had ruled through fear and careful compromise, simply ceased to exist. Its chambers stood empty. Its ambassadors had nowhere to return to. 12,000 years of history ended not with a battle, but with a quiet realization that nothing remained to enforce. In its place, something new emerged. The Free Galactic Assembly met for the first time on a neutral station, built specifically for this moment. Representatives from dozens of species filled the Great Hall, some of them former enemies, some of them former subjects, all of them equals for the first time in living memory. Ambassador Song stood before them, representing humanity. She was 61 years old, a former teacher who had spent most of her life explaining history to children. She had never expected to shape the future of civilization itself. But the universe had a strange way of choosing its heroes. "We did not ask for this war," she said, her voice carrying through the silent hall. "We did not want it. When the Council's ambassador came to us with their terms, we hoped for a peaceful solution. We hoped that we could find common ground." She paused, looking at the assembled delegates. Crystalline beings sat beside scaled warriors. Creatures of pure energy floated near species that looked almost human. The diversity was overwhelming. But we learned something when we read those terms. We learned that the Council was not offering partnership. They were offering slavery with a pretty name. They were asking us to give away everything that made us who we are. Her hands gripped the podium, steady despite her age. So we refused. We chose to fight. And we learned something else in the years that followed. We learned that we were not alone in wanting freedom. We learned that other species had accepted those terms only because they saw no alternative. We learned that the chains the Council had placed on the galaxy were held together by nothing more than fear. She smiled, a tired but genuine smile. Fear is a fragile thing. It breaks when someone is brave enough to challenge it. On Earth, the memorials were still being built. The names were still being carved into stone and metal, names that would stand for centuries as reminders of what had been lost. Parks were being converted into gardens of remembrance. Statues were being raised in city squares. Colonel Bay stood at the dedication of the 442 monument. He was 27 now, no longer the boy who had lied about his age to enlist. The plasma scars on his chest had faded but never disappeared. He wore them as reminders of how close he had come to death and how far he had traveled since. The monument was a simple thing, a wall of black stone with names carved into it, thousands of names, tens of thousands, each one a person who had lived and fought and died so that others could be free. Read the names slowly, moving his lips as he pronounced each one. Some of them he recognized, friends from training, soldiers he had fought beside, officers who had led him through impossible battles. Others were strangers, people he had never met, whose sacrifice had still somehow touched his life. He found the name he was looking for near the bottom of one panel. Oh, the captain who had driven his ship into the enemy flagship at 442. The man whose sacrifice had given the human fleet those precious extra minutes. "I never met you," said quietly. His words meant for no one but the stone and the wind. "But I'm still alive because of what you did. Thank you." In a small house by the sea, Dr. Lee was teaching medicine to young students. She had retired from active practice 2 years ago when her hands finally became too unsteady for surgery. But she could still teach. She could still pass on what she knew. Her students sat around her in a circle, young men and women who had been children when the war began. They listened as she explained the basics of trauma care, how to assess wounds, how to prioritize patients, how to keep working when everything around you was falling apart. The most important tool you have, she told them, is not in your medical kit. It's in your head. You have to stay calm, you have to think clearly, because when you panic, people die. One of the students raised her hand. Dr. Lee, during the war, were you ever afraid? Was silent for a moment, remembering. She remembered the smell of the field hospital, the endless parade of wounded soldiers, the faces of the young people she had saved and the faces of those she had lost. I was terrified, she said finally, every single day, but I kept working anyway, because fear is not a reason to stop. Fear is just a feeling. It passes, but the work remains. Admiral No commanded the peacekeeping fleet now, a collection of ships from a dozen species that patrolled the former Council territories. Her job was to ensure that no civilization would ever again face the choice humanity had faced. No more ultimatums. No more terms written by oppressors. No more chains disguised as protection. She stood on the bridge of her new flagship, watching the stars drift past the viewport. The war had aged her. Gray streaked her hair. Lines marked her face. But her eyes were still sharp, still watching, still ready. A communication came through from the Free Assembly. Ambassador Song appeared on the screen, looking tired but satisfied. The ratification is complete, said. The Free Galactic Charter is now law. Every member species has signed. No nodded slowly. Then it's really over. One part of it is over. The building part is just beginning, smiled. We won the war, Admiral. Now we have to win the peace. On New Seoul, former president watched the sunrise from her garden. She was 80 years old now, long retired from public life. Her hands shook when she held her teacup. Her eyes needed help to read, but she could still see the sun rising over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. Her granddaughter sat beside her, a girl of 12 who had never known a world at war. She had been born in the first year of peace, part of a generation that would grow up free. Grandmother, the girl said, tell me about the war again. Smiled and took a sip of her tea. The old memories came easily now, softened by time and distance. The war began, she said, because we refused to accept chains. The galaxy wanted us to kneel and we said no. That's the simple version. The complicated version would take years to tell. But why did we refuse? The history books say we couldn't win. They say the odds were impossible. Set down her teacup and looked at her granddaughter with eyes that had seen too much, and hoped too hard, and somehow still believed in better things. Because some things matter more than winning or losing. Some things matter more than odds or calculations or what makes logical sense. She reached out and took the girl's hand. Freedom is one of those things. Dignity is one of those things. The right to live your life without someone else's chains around your neck. The girl was quiet for a moment, thinking. Then she asked, would you do it again, knowing what it cost? Looked at the sunrise, at the peaceful city below, at the sky that no longer held enemy ships. She thought about all the names on all the memorials, all the lives lost, all the sacrifices made. Yes, she said simply, we would do it all again, because some things are worth any price. The war had cost humanity everything. Millions of lives, decades of peace, resources that could have built wonders instead of weapons. The scars would take generations to heal. But they had won. Not just the war, but something greater. They had proven that the galaxy's oldest chains could be broken. They had shown that no empire was too powerful to challenge, no odds too impossible to face. Because when humans chose not to negotiate, they were not just rejecting terms. They were declaring something that the galaxy had forgotten, something that 12,000 years of careful control had almost erased from memory. Some species kneel.